Welcome to Season 4 of In the Lead with UCEA. I'm your host, Mónica Byrne-Jiménez, Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration. In this podcast, UCEA presents pivotal conversations with people making an impact on educational leadership preparation, practice, and policy. Learn about the latest happenings and cutting-edge research from UCEA's community of scholars. This season, we dive into how education-focused organizations can learn from each other and work to advocate for educational leadership and preparation at the state level. We talk with experts in research, policy, and practice to learn more about the opportunities for state-level advocacy and imagine how we can collaborate to support the success of each and every child. In this episode, we are joined by Dan Gordon. Dan is a principal at EducationCounsel, where he leads a variety of K-12 projects focused on advancing learning system approaches and supporting school districts to expand opportunities and accelerate improved outcomes for all students. Before joining EducationCounsel in 2014, Dan served the District of Columbia Public Schools as a senior advisor for school design, as deputy chief academic officer for college and career readiness, early childhood education, language acquisition, and out-of-school time programs, and as chief of staff to the chief academic officer. Previously, he was a lead English teacher at Columbia Heights Education Campus in Washington, D.C. Dan started his career as a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division's Educational Opportunities Section, where he enforced federal education anti-discrimination statutes across the nation. What is the current national policy landscape, and what are the implications for educational leadership? Listen here to find out. Dan, it is so nice to have you. Thank you very, very much. And we could spend like hours talking about each one of those semicolons.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for all you're doing and for having me on to talk shop a little bit.
Wonderful. So, why don't we just sort of dive in? And if you could talk to us a little bit about what the Education Council is and what is the work that you do?
Sure. Yeah, it's we're a mission-driven education consulting firm. We do early childhood and K-12 and higher ed. My focus tends to be more on the K-12, just given my background.
Mhm.
And we sort of do a lot of things. We do some strategy work. We do a lot of connecting of dots and bringing folks together. Sometimes folks who are already talking to each other and need some help,
Oh,
facilitating and accomplishing collective goals. Sometimes bringing folks together who should be talking to each other in the education system, but just aren't. Um, and uh, and then we do a little bit of legal work. Like you heard, I have a legal background, and some of my colleagues do. And the firm got started by two folks who were senior leaders in the Clinton administration, in the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. The former Secretary of Education, Dick Riley, former governor of South Carolina, is sort of an official member of our team.
mm,
But that tends to be a little bit more using our legal training to help make sense of things. And then every once in a while, getting involved in, like, say, an amicus brief in the Supreme Court, things like that. But we mostly just try and pursue our mission of having a more effective education system that is driving towards excellence and equity. And currently, I seem to spend most of my time trying to keep up with everything that's happening in federal education policy and help translate that as much as possible for the field.
right. Yeah, no, every time I talk to someone from Ed Council, Dan, I feel like I get smarter. So, no high stakes here, don't
Yeah,
worry.
you're supposed to. I said this recently. Part of my contract for doing things like this is that you under promise, so I can over deliver, and you have violated that very
Oh,
important.
no, that compact, right?
Yeah,
But I wanted to pick up on a little thing where that you just sort of ended on there about sort of what's happening, nationally in the federal landscape, and I know Ed Council has a really unique vantage point to that, and so from the work that you're doing right now, what do you see as some of the important, shifts that are happening in educational policy right now?
sure. Yeah, a lot. We talk about the administration has a bit of a flood the zone approach. There's just so much happening all the time that it can be hard to kind of get your arms around it. And so part of this, and I'm sure it will come up in our conversation, is just how do we make sense of it all?
Right.
And then part of it, and this is, I think, one of the most important things that we're certainly trying to do, and I'm sure you're trying to do with your members, is help separate, the signal from the noise. The
Mm,
signal of what's really important, what has actually changed,
mhm,
what do I need to incorporate new into my thinking and my calculations, and how I pursue my mission and my goals, and what's noise, what is um, threats about
mhm,
things that haven't happened, or overstatements of things, or media reporting that doesn't quite get it right, and so to the extent that we can, sort of uh, do that for folks. I think that's like one of the roles that I think we can help play. So to
mhm,
your question, I think there's a bunch of kind of themes at play. One theme we have to start with is that President Trump has sort of taken up what has been a longstanding priority or policy priority for the Republican Party and really embraced it, which is to say to dramatically reduce the federal role in education. You see that most clearly in sort of talk about eliminating the U.S. Department of Justice, which is something that's been on the party platform of the Republicans for a long time. But President
mhm,
Trump has said, no, no, I'm really serious about this, and I'm going to take steps to make that happen. And we can talk about what that the signal from the noise there,
mhm,
between what is said and what's actually happened or happening or can happen. But that's on one hand, it's like, trying to cut the Department of Education out or reducing the workforce. We've already seen a 50% reduction in force or RIF for the Department of Education, or cutting programs and funding. And we can talk about some of the things that have already been cut. Um, but then there's the second theme, I'd say. So there's like reduce the role, but then there's like, okay, we have a reduced role. What are we using it for?
mhm,
And there's a real trend that we're already seeing, just 3 months in, of leveraging the remaining capacity
mhm,
in very direct ways to advance the not the department, the administration's priorities. So you see this most uh, dramatically in the role of in the area of civil rights enforcement.
mhm,
um, the Office of Civil Rights had 12 regional offices around the country. These are offices filled with lawyers, that civil rights lawyers that, on behalf of the Department of Education, investigate claims of discrimination and go through all sorts of processes. I'm sure some of your members have engaged with the Office of Civil Rights for different reasons, and they investigate complaints of discrimination. And when they find evidence of discrimination, they work with the institutions, to root that out and come
mhm,
up with remedial plans and things. So, it's sort of the core functioning of our civil rights enforcement in education. And that they cut it from 12 of those offices down to 7. So then the question is, okay, so you've shrunk it by more than half, and maybe even more with like some of the other ways that
mhm,
folks have been fired. So what are you doing with that capacity? And from the traditional focus of civil rights enforcement of vindicating the rights and protecting the most vulnerable of our population. It's often students of color, students with disabilities, multilingual learners. What you see in the administration is a real focus on three administration priorities. One on sort of the anti DEI
mhm,
side of things, which we can talk about later, but sort of using civil rights laws to protect the rights of white students against what the administration has characterized as DEI. The second is um, uh, using civil rights laws to go after the ways that colleges in particular have responded to acts of anti-Semitism
mhm,
on campus. And the third is around the issue of women and their rights, cisgender women's rights vis-a-vis transgender women and girls,
mhm,
often in the sports context, but not only. And it's those three things, the anti-DEI, the anti-Semitism work, and the um, gender equity or anti-transgender students' rights, that you see the sort of the remaining infrastructure of the civil rights that we have in education being used. And so
mhm,
that's like sort of the second thing I would flag for you, like just from the 1,000 foot or 3,000 or 30,000 foot level. You've got like
As far
reduce
as
the
away
role.
as you can get, right?
Right. So it's like, reduce the role and then leverage the what's remaining to advance your priorities. And that's not, I mean, like that's not unusual for a new administration to say, hey, I've got my priorities and I want to use the resources at hand to do that. But we're seeing the reduction is unprecedented, and the leveraging, and the sort of, I don't know, aggressiveness of that leveraging is also unprecedented. And so I think those are, the first two things that would come to mind.
Right. Um, Gosh, there's so much there I could ask you about. But I wanted to go back to the metaphor of signal versus noise. And I think that's a really important one. And I think that's one that people are looking like people need that filter to help them be able to focus on what needs to get focused on, set aside what is just a distraction, and then continue to do the work. And so I think particularly, and I'll sort of ask you about that in the context of public P-12 education, where you've got, as you said, those three focal areas that are being very strongly put forth into the public's education sphere. Um, and so, what are you seeing there about the implications of all those signals in P-12 education?
Yeah, this is one of the many things that is keeping me up at night. So we worry a lot about, what we call preemptive compliance.
Mm,
And I think the biggest, I'll sort of unpack that, but like the biggest risk of the signal and like confusing the signal for the noise or not
mhm,
finding the signal in the noise is that the noise is scary and all encompassing and really dramatic. And the concern is that folks, like, sort of, because they're not able to, or are struggling to find that signal, instead listen to the noise, and it drives them to comply, to change things, to comply with what they think or being told what the law is, or that the law has suddenly changed to be. And they're complying not when they're forced to, because there's been an investigation and, or a court case, or, something that is really sort of, um, called the question. And instead, they're preemptively complying in advance. Right. So, like an example, there's all sorts of actions that the administration has taken against, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll use DEI as a acronym for that, but we should
mm,
come back to it, right? Because the acronym is quite contested, right? But
right.
but anyway, so things advancing, diversity, equity, and inclusion in education. There's, he's done executive orders and enforcement actions, and certainly lots and lots of headlines that literally say things like President Trump outlaws DEI.
Mm,
Well, that's not true.
right.
There's a lot wrong with that statement. And we can talk about what's wrong with that, but the truth is that there are people in the country, including people in charge of, really
Mm,
important and sophisticated institutions, that, are getting the message that President Trump said, this thing that we do to advance DEI has been declared illegal. And gosh, we better stop doing illegal things.
mm,
And let's stop doing that thing now before someone comes and takes all of our funding. And that to your question of like, what's the, why worry about the signal and the noise, piece? It's because it can lead to preemptive compliance, or it can, or maybe even not preemptive compliance, but over rotating.
mm,
So you make a smart decision as an institution or as an individual to change something, but are you changing, just enough to
right.
meet this new concern that's been raised for you, or are you over rotating and, wiping away all sorts of, throw, I don't know, I'm going to just throw all sorts of metaphors into this, throw the baby out with the bathwater. you know, um, and maybe comply in advance. And when you're complying in advance, you're over rotating and getting rid of all this stuff. And you see this in all sorts of ways. I don't know if I should use really hard examples or really, easy examples, but let me give you an easy example. Is that in the out of education, the Department of Defense is one of those agencies that has taken the president's push on the anti-DEI stuff very seriously, and like moved very quickly to sort of scrub out all references to anything associated with DEI.
Mm,
And one of the things that's been reported, you may have seen this in the news, was that, they've gone through all the things that are online and different DoD websites to scrub out anything that might be related to DEI. And so there was this time when they like eliminated anything about the Tuskegee airmen,
Mm,
and like there was a big outcry, and they went back and put it back in. But one of the other things that came up was the Enola Gay, which is a
mm,
famous
right.
bombing, plane. There were pictures of the Enola Gay and the story of its exploits in war, and it was taken down presumably because someone did a Control F search, and the
Sure.
word "gay" came up. And so like I know that's an absurd thing, and that's not what your listeners are really grappling with, but it just goes to the example
Mm,
of that kind of over
over course
rotation,
correcting, yeah.
over course correcting, exactly.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I think that's such a challenge for leaders, right? Or even for, for leaders in K-12, for, faculty and leaders in higher ed, right? Like, what is the right amount of compliance and what's the correct amount of wait and see, right? And let's wait and see how things play out in the courts, and then we'll make decisions based on, the law as it is. And I think part of what is also very challenging about this notion of, complying in advance or overly course correcting, um, is the ease with which, and you sort of mentioned this sort of, the civil rights of students with disabilities or multilingual learners or, minoritized communities um, get sort of wiped away. And particularly in schools, right? And so there's lots of concern around students with special needs in schools once money, the way the money formulas are changed and all of that. And so I think maybe if you have a sort of a, I guess, a more specific example or hard example of where you've seen some of that playing out, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah. It Well, let me say two things. One is, I should have said this up front. I am not providing legal advice
Legal
on
counsel.
this on this podcast. Let's
I
just be clear.
understand.
So one definite
There
advice,
speaks the lawyer.
right? And like someone's like shocking me, with an electric prod, to make sure that people know I'm not giving legal advice. I think one of the things that leaders of systems and institutions like absolutely should be doing is consulting their legal counsel, right? But the other is to really understand, um, what something you said about following the law.
Mm,
So a lot of those headlines that come across that lead to preemptive compliance are on the basis of these, very public, um, executive orders that the president is signing. And executive orders are not new, but they do not change the law.
right.
They're effectively a memo from the president to the agencies of the executive branch saying, "Hey, this is how we're going to operate. This is how I want the federal government to work." But executive orders cannot change the law. The Congress changes the law. Sometimes the courts interpret the law or
Mm,
interpret what the Constitution provides, and that can change, particularly the contours and
mhm,
the boundaries of the law. Federal agencies, if they engage in formal rulemaking, that involves a lot of process steps and the right of the public to weigh in, can
mhm,
issue final rules that have the force of law, that your institutional leaders do have to follow.
mhm,
But none of those, legislation from Congress, interpretations from the federal courts, or final rules, establishes is what an executive order does. The executive order says this is our administration's approach to this. So that's one thing is like is to really stop and ask yourself, and if you're a stakeholder, ask your leadership, why are we doing this?
mhm,
What this change that you're contemplating doing, what's the reason? And if the
mhm,
reason is, well, we have to because the law has changed, well, you got to peel that onion back a little bit,
mhm,
right? What has changed? How do you know it's changed? And frankly, the same thing goes the other direction. We're just outside of 100 days of the administration. There's been over 200 lawsuits about different things the administration's
mhm,
doing. A lot of those lawsuits, if you're not someone who's familiar with the way litigation unfolds, you might see a headline that says, courts find, illegal this thing, or courts find legal this thing. And the truth is that a lot of those are early decisions,
mhm,
temporary decisions,
right,
preliminary decisions that don't get to the point of a final say
mhm,
about whether something was legal or illegal. And so it's the other way is that, you also have to worry that if not worry, you have to make sure that institutional leaders don't see oh, wow, this court,
right,
temporarily put a hold on this thing. Well, that doesn't, and so therefore, it's illegal and I don't have to pay attention to it.
mhm,
Well, they may have just temporarily done it for the next couple days while they considered, full arguments about it,
Right.
or maybe they changed it only for the people in that one place in Vermont,
Right.
and that doesn't apply to us too. So it goes both ways in terms of, whether it's news that you find good because of where you
Mhm.
stand, or news
Mhm.
that you find troubling because of where you stand. It's really important to kind of go behind the headline. Some of the You asked about, like, sort of what are harder cases. So the harder cases are tend to be things that are happening in P-12 schools or in higher ed to advance um, diversity, to take better advantage of the benefits of a diverse student body
Mhm.
and workforce, to make our schools more equitable, where people get what they need to succeed, and more inclusive. Places that where there's a sense of belonging, and that all are welcome. And the Supreme Court, in lots of cases over time, and including the more recent case involving admissions at Harvard University and University of North Carolina, said that diversity is a really worthy goal, and it's something that's commendable that institutions pursue. But when we do a legal analysis, it's not enough of a reason. It's not, in legal terms,
Mhm.
a compelling interest that justifies using someone's racial status as a as a as a um, as the reason for
Mhm.
conferring a benefit or withholding a benefit. So in
Right.
the in the case of those cases, admission a spot in an incoming class. And so the harder ones are about things that, like, well, okay, so what does that mean for this
Mm.
program I'm doing? Am I conferring a benefit here? Because if I am conferring a benefit, then I have to worry that I'm conferring it to people. Maybe I've designed a program, like, I don't know, a mentoring program, then I'm
Mhm.
and I'm
Mhm.
offering the mentoring program to people based on the racial status, and I may have lots of good reasons for doing that,
Right.
but, like, the harder question is, from a legal analysis, and if brought into court, is it a defensible position
Mm.
for you to award seats in that mentoring program on the basis of students' racial status? And again, I'm not often those things are complicated, and there's really important factual context, and I don't want to. I'm not here to, like, at all issue, you know
Mhm.
this is okay and this is not okay. But um, there are just things that you do in a K-12 system, in a higher ed system, where you are doing things that benefit everyone,
Right.
but maybe you're motivated by the fact that, doing this will help
Right.
remove a barrier, right?
Right.
That has, like, gotten in the way historically and currently from our most vulnerable populations or minoritized populations, like you
Mhm.
said. And so I don't mean to suggest those are hard. In fact, I urge, in general, like, after consulting with your counsel, I urge your listeners to really double down and not run away from
Right.
from diversity and equity and inclusion and accessibility. Like, these are things that we all want, and the public wants. There's great polling on this.
Right.
It's the toxicity of the sort of, I mentioned I was, like, reluctant to use DEI, not because I don't believe in DEI, but, like, DEI, those three letters put together, has become this, sort of toxic
Right.
thing that isn't defined, and everything under the sun is considered part of it. But we're not going to say what is and isn't.
Right.
And so that's, I think, where leaders and institutions can run into trouble when they
Mhm.
get confused between the sort of, language and attention and anger about DEI, compared to, oh, here's a program that we're doing to benefit our institution and
Mhm.
the students that we educate.
Right.
Like, is this program okay, or have we designed it in a thoughtful way? Does it comply with the law? Because of course we want to comply with the law,
Mhm.
and then decide, like, what to do. But if you just stop at the noise that it surrounds
Right.
everything DEI, um, I worry that people will make some of those unwise decisions.
Yeah. And I also sort of hear in what you're saying just this glimmer, very tiny, I mean, glimmer of opportunity for institutions to actually, rethink, recommit, redefine sort of like the compelling interest, right, of the program or whatever. Something that we've taken for granted for many years. And now you're like, okay, now we really are going to have to make a much different argument that is both in in the public interest and in the interest of individuals. So I think that that's really interesting. And even as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh, we're going back to universal design, right? Where it's like you want something that removes barriers for everybody,
Yeah.
as the norm, right?
Right. And it's there's an old colleague of mine from DC public schools who's um, does a lot of sort of equity training, and she
Mm,
always talks about designing for the margins.
mm,
You know that if you design for the folks who, for lots
right,
of reasons, right, are in the on the margins of our team, of our institution, of our sector, of our society, that almost invariably that design benefits everyone.
right.
And you see that in the technology world,
Mm,
and you certainly see that in education when it comes to pedagogy and all sorts of decisions.
mhm.
And so, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the. I'm with you on it being a glimmer, but like there's an opportunity,
Thanks.
right? And also to the extent that it does exactly what you said, you know, um, let's be honest. Let's have an honest conversation with ourselves. Let's reflect.
Right.
We're like, what are we after here? What is our mission? What are our institutional
Mhm,
values? What is it that we're trying to do? And then two really important questions like, have we designed things in a way that's legal and and effective at accomplishing what we want? Because maybe there's always room for improvement, right?
right,
And then the other is, are we communicating about it
right.
in an effective, accurate way? Because I think what's happened, my sense from a lot of institutions is that they're realizing that they really weren't communicating super clearly about what
Right.
they're doing,
Mhm,
but also they often weren't talking about why they were doing it and how they're doing it.
right.
And the why and the how can be just as, if not more important, to make sure that folks understand the what.
Mhm,
And so if this noise and to the extent that you grab onto that signal and apply that, we're going to take this metaphor, for all it's worth. Like,
Okay,
you know,
yes. We need something else quick.
to the extent that you are following that signal, make sure that you bring people along with you.
Right. Right, right, right. So we've talked a lot about what is happening to public education, to educators. Um, what can you tell us about efforts that are being done either state or at the federal level to sort of respond to what's being done to us? So where are the bigger glimmers of hope and opportunity?
Yeah, well, so I'd say a couple different things. First, is there are a lot of um, organizations, coalitions, associations, individual folks who are just activated, right? Who see the risks that are uh, facing public education, and they're responding in different ways. And there's a lot of connection and collaboration and coordination, including groups and organizations that aren't always on the same page about
Right.
things. So I think you're seeing, and you see this in both K-12 and higher ed. Folks coming together around a common cause,
Mm,
and often putting aside, their differences on X policy or
right.
Y um, issue. And I think the more that happens, the better. There's strength in numbers, there's strength in coalition building, um, and it's very hard in the current circumstances for individuals and individual institutions to stand up
Mm,
on their
right.
own. Um, I'm just someone who sits, in a Washington D.C. based, consulting firm. Like, my kids make fun of me for just, being typing emails and talking on Zooms all day. I'm not the one doing the work, but banding together and particularly when you think about some of the things that really get at some of the fundamental um, reasons, the fundamental mission of, say, higher
Mm,
education. I do a lot of work on sort of thinking of the research and development, the R&D infrastructure, and in education, and how we can have education at all levels function more like what we call a learning system.
mhm,
Not learning like learning to read and write, but
right.
learning,
Mm,
learning and improving. Like,
right.
we have this ironically weak infrastructure and culture of learning in
Right.
education, even though we're in an endeavor that's about
Yep.
helping people, do that.
I'm
So
with you, Dan.
yeah, so it's like you're like, see podcast, season 2, episode 4. So and a lot of that is under attack. There's a very different view of the value and of the current approach to education R&D and learning what works for whom and under what
Mhm.
circumstances, and then helping people in the field, incorporate those learnings into their daily practice,
Mhm.
and then the standard of care that they provide to students of all ages. And um, and a lot of that infrastructure is currently under attack.
Mhm.
And so you see folks in that space coming together in um, inspirational ways, I'll say,
Mhm.
to work together and say, hey, this is fundamental to what we want for students and their families, and we have to defend it.
Mhm.
And at the same time, and I don't know, I'm sure this is not a surprise, but at the same time, it's important to be honest about, hey, like, things need to improve.
Right.
And many of the folks that are banding together spend a lot of their time saying, hey, the status quo is not okay. And
Right.
it's not okay for I think it's not okay for this reason, and you
Right.
think it's not okay for that reason, but we agree that the status quo needs to be
Right.
improved. And so we also don't want to be stuck in a, like, we're only defending the status quo.
Right.
It's more that they're to really accomplish a sustainable vision for something better, we have to get there in a way that works, that
Mhm.
doesn't leave people behind or cause harm,
Right.
and that's done in a way that's truly sustainable
Right.
and achievable. And I think that's where the folks coming together are are seeing sort of the I don't know, the glimmer or the opportunity,
Mhm.
in amidst the risks.
Right. Well,
The other
I'm
thing I'm sorry, the other thing I'd say, just to carry you asked about the states, is that, one thing in a lot of the rhetoric around the desire to reduce the role of the federal government
mm,
in education, particularly in K-12 education, is around returning power to the states
right.
and returning power to communities. And I'm sure especially the school leaders that you work with, know that while there are guardrails that the federal government places, particularly as we talked about earlier,
Right.
against discrimination and to protect civil rights, the federal government has very little to say
Mhm.
about all the most important decisions that are made in K-12 education. That is really already almost entirely driven by states and by
Right.
communities. But there are some federal guardrails and some federal requirements, and whatever you think of those, and I think many of them are really important and worth
Mhm.
defending. Whatever you think of those, there is a potential that even more decision making might return to the states, and that might be done through waivers, and like we can talk
Mhm.
about sort of the mechanisms, but
Right.
just in general, like you asked at the beginning about sort of themes and what's going on in the big picture. One big picture, and it remains to be seen how this actually plays out. But one big picture thing is just this shift of more flexibility, more authority to state and local decision makers. And so to your question of, well, what's happening? So that's a little bit TBD,
Mhm.
but we'll be seeing a lot of decisions and priorities and values coming out of the states. And depending on where you sit and what you care most about, you're going to have different opinions about how different states take advantage of that flexibility or that increased autonomy. And you mentioned I started my career as a civil rights lawyer. That's sort of my initial stance, which is
Mhm.
that a lot of those guardrails are in place because we have a long history in our country of
And
people not doing so well under that kind of a decision making scheme. And so I worry a lot about the folks who have the least amount of power in states and in communities, and how those decisions will be made when if there's less of a federal backstop, helping our guardrails, helping protect them. But to your point, we also may see cool new innovations and states that try things that whether it's a real or perceived barrier,
right.
the federal government had been somehow preventing them from trying it. And I'm using careful language there because I think a lot of times it's more of a perceived barrier, and
Right.
there's actually already a lot of authority to do things that they want. But for whatever reason, if a state leader is like, I've always wanted to do this thing, and I just never had the opportunity, or I've worried the feds would get in my way. Well, maybe that thing will get tried out, and it'll be wonderful, and other states will learn from it, and you know
Right.
we can come out having something new that we all like. Um, so that's my going with you on the glimmer. Uh,
I
the glim-
appreciate that because, we all need glimmers occasionally. But I
sure.
think, I mean, one thing that and obviously we could keep talking and my goodness, I'd love to come to talk to you again someday more about this. But I think the sustaining effort that you're talking about in terms of, coalition building and partners, finding common ground to protect the things that they value. Um, is sort of what you said, sort of like connection, coordination, and coalition, right? Um, was that right? Connection,
It
coordination,
is. It's
and
right now. You just coined it.
yeah, exactly, and I was like, that's the work that both higher ed and P12 need to do, and anyone who cares about schools, whatever the state or the level of it. So, I think I'll leave us with that, and what are the ways in which organizations can really begin to have different conversations, around, connecting and coordinating and moving forward together, in sort of in the hopes of like you said, of creating something better. So, I'm gonna end it there because that's making me feel good.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Dan, thanks so much. I appreciate all the work that you're doing. And see, I am leaving a little smarter than I was when we started talking. So you're off the hook there.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. This was
Thank
a great
you.
conversation.
In the Lead is produced by University FM. We'd like to thank the UCEA community and you, our listeners, for your commitment to improving educational leadership and policy to create equitable, ethical, and socially just outcomes for each child.